Hello everyone, my name is Cindy Oraro, a partner here at Oraro and Company Advocates, where I specialize in energy, infrastructure, and projects. Welcome to this episode of the OCO Roundtable podcast. Today, we delve into the realm of carbon trading and entrepreneurship amidst the pressing challenge of climate change. As we stand on the precipice of the unprecedented effects of climate change and grapple with the rising need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, carbon trading has emerged as a powerful tool in our collective effort to mitigate the impact of climate change and raise climate finance for adaptation and mitigation, particularly in the global south. Carbon trading offers a structured mechanism that encourages governments and private parties alike to adopt sustainable practices. As you might remember, in September 2023, Kenya hosted the Africa Climate Week and the Africa Climate Summit, which largely focused on the collaboration between stakeholders in the sustainability ecosystem. Among the prominent topics on the agenda was the exploration of carbon trading and the critical actions that African countries and businesses should undertake to advance this practice as a pivotal means of addressing the challenges of climate change. During this time, Kenya enacted the Climate Change Amendment Act 2023, which builds on the foundation laid by the Climate Change Act of 2016 in pushing her a step forward towards realizing her obligations under the Paris Agreement. This Amendment Act is a welcome development as it creates the much-needed regulatory framework for carbon trading, such as the establishment of a carbon registry to track carbon credit projects and transfers. Additionally, there is the proposed climate change carbon market regulations, which are currently making their way through the legislative process. The regulations, when gazetted, will complement the Amendment Act by providing a framework for carbon credit projects and programs. Further, we have the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Forestry's Draft Strategic Plan 2023 to 2027, which sets out strategies including the development of a carbon market framework essential for the country to meet her climate change obligations. In this episode, we will focus on the growth of carbon trading as a powerful instrument in the ongoing fight against climate change and its effects, particularly on the African continent. Today, we have the privilege of hosting Brian Nyangena. Nyangena is a dynamic individual with a diverse background. He serves as a co-founder and CEO of Verst, specializing in unlocking Africa's potential in carbon markets by addressing participation bottlenecks. He has a decade of experience in finance and data and is also pursuing a PhD in blockchain and deep reinforcement learning to enhance energy access in Nyangena is deeply committed to leveraging technology for positive impact, particularly in the realm of carbon markets and universal energy access. Nyangena, karibu.
Thank you.
We are delighted to have you here. So let's dive right into it. Your experience spans entrepreneurship, investment, and creating technology-enabled platforms for carbon markets. What initially sparked your interest in these areas?
Interesting. So when I did my bachelor in actuarial science, and that was sparked by a deep need to be able to solve problems, especially complex problems involving numbers. Immediately after campus, I got into a trading company that was based off of the US and was opening an office here in Africa. Traded with them in the US and India for over 3 years in commodity markets. And being in that space showed me a lot of what technology can do. Because when we were coming into it, a lot of the things we were doing were manual, and then getting into the space, just seeing how technology transformed the sector sparked my interest in that. And then I remember wanting to try the entrepreneurship journey because I don't do really well being employed. And I always like having ideas to try it out. So got into business. My first foray into entrepreneurship was not very successful. Didn't do a really good job. But eventually, because I was in the space of trading around that place, got into blockchain technology. Back then, when I read much into the space, I started seeing that you can solve a lot of problems. Lucky enough for me, around COVID time, I met a lot of interesting individuals who were in the energy space and were interested in understanding how can the frameworks such as blockchain, which enhance transparency, be used on this other end. So that then sparked my foray on that. Did a couple of consultancy jobs under one of the company I started. When we were doing an assignment on what carbon markets can benefit from when using technology, I was giving a lot of suggestions of Western countries that can come in and the people who are doing something on carbon. Then I thought, we need to have an African voice. Then side Verst Carbon as that player who will just try and steer the conversation forward. It's been almost 2 years now being in the space, done a lot of interesting work, and I will be happy to unpack all the experiences and learnings I did.
That's quite interesting. But let's get into your journey in building and creating Verst Carbon. So how did you see an opportunity to leverage technology in this carbon trading?
Fair enough of a question. When doing my research, the client had requested me to tell them who were the players on the space within the continent, what it is they were doing, and how technology can enhance some of the challenges that carbon markets have. Because in as much as carbon trading, carbon markets have been touted as a solution towards adaptation and mitigation efforts, there are a bit of challenges around that technology can try and elevate. So when you're looking at that, most of the innovative players who are coming up with solutions to solve some of those challenges were not companies native in the continent. And a lot of them were not doing that. So one of the challenges, for instance, I will tell you, was access to finance. It was a very key challenge for us to be able to advance these opportunities. Climate finance is very much needed. How does that finance flow here? Investors are a bit apprehensive about the perceived risk of investing within the continent. And that is like, it's almost exacerbated because of the fact that there doesn't exist transparency frameworks that support that. Me coming from a background of blockchain, which is at the cornerstone of enhancing transparency and integrity, I was able to draw that nexus, and I was like, maybe there's something I can do here. Come up with a solution that will make it easy for investors to feel comfortable channeling finance to where it is actually needed. And then when I saw what potential we can have to channel this finance and actually undertake activities that will help us in our climate journey, I thought that the opportunity was prime, and a lot of people are not doing that. So being a creator, having done a lot of things on data, coming up with solutions, I gathered a couple of my friends and told them, we need to put our heart into this thing. Let's start creating a solution around that. Initially, when starting this out, we were trying to channel our efforts towards channeling climate finance to where it's needed, helping people to have clear benefit sharing mechanisms, and giving that transparency to investors and project developers, because a lot of the revenue leakage was happening in the carbon cycle. So I was trying to figure out, how do we try and solve that? That's when we started building out our solution to try and address those challenges.
How do you see technology influencing the evolving landscape of carbon markets?
Do you want the long version or the short version?
I want your version.
Okay. So I'll start by giving a bit of a framework around how carbon markets work. There's a voluntary carbon market side and the compliance side. Compliance is on the domain of governments in agreement with something called the Paris Agreement that was agreed upon with various countries. And then the
Paris Agreement of 2015.
Yes, that it is. And then there's a voluntary carbon market, which is what has gained a lot of traction over the couple of years. And most players are trying to get into the space. It is not necessarily very well regulated, so frameworks need to exist to support that. But it's within this voluntary carbon market space that we are participating in, because we see a lot of efforts that are being put in by both project developers from the global south and people who are trying to channel finances into these projects. So how I see technology playing a key role is in the process of you developing a carbon project, there are a lot of inefficiencies that then drive up the cost of developing a carbon project. It is not a cheap endeavor. I've seen projects use north of $1 million just to develop a carbon project, and 50,000 by my estimations is the minimum that you can use to develop a project. And majority of those costs are things that can be really well elaborated through technology. I'll give you one clear advantage that the space is looking into. There's something called digital monitoring, reporting, and verification. So when you've started a carbon project, for you to be able to claim carbon credits out of a project, after registration, you have to go through a monitoring period, which typically takes a year. The process of doing that is not very cheap. And part of the reason for that is, let me take us through a primer. When you're developing a carbon project, there are registries, the people who actually issue the carbon credits on your behalf. There are not a lot of them. Most commonly known under the voluntary carbon markets is Verra, Gold Standard, Plan Vivo. Those are the most common ones. Their presence Verra has the largest presence in the continent. When you're submitting a project to Verra, you need a third-party validator to look at the design document that you've created before being given an approval to say that you actually are adhering to the right standards. The people who do that are called verification and validation bodies, VVBs. There are not enough of them. Like in the continent, there is no VVB. Most of the players come from India, Europe, and all the Western states. So the cost of you bringing in a VVB to validate your project before it gets registered to a registry is a cost. when you've done your project and you're doing your monitoring, reporting, and verification, they have to send someone who would come to the field and do a couple of things. And because they're a very limited number of them, the cost goes up. So digital monitoring, reporting, and verification has been touted as a solution towards that, which is you're leveraging technology to collect the data that is involved in the monitoring, reporting, and verification, and by extension, reducing the cost that it will take for you to come and monitor the projects on the ground. So creating clear frameworks of how the data will be collected in adherence to the standards. And a next added advantage to that is you now no longer have to wait a minimum of a year. The minimum is a year, but most projects take 2 or 3 years. They almost batch up the verification to reduce on the costs. But in this case now, you're getting a situation where you're verifying your projects that much quickly, and you can start earning your credits now on a monthly basis. Like there's a project in Sierra Leone. It wasn't exactly on carbon markets, but it was on the renewable energy credits. And they tried piloting something similar to this, and they're being issued on a monthly basis. So innovation has a chance of being able to solve one of those challenges on the carbon markets. There are many others. Some of them we're doing, but that's one I'll give. And if you want to get into the others, I'll be happy to do that.
Well, that's quite insightful. You've talked about how, say, for example, with VVBs, there are very few on the continent. None, actually. And you've also talked about how expensive it is to develop a carbon credit project. But do you see a space for governments to create an enabling environment for investment, and particularly through establishing robust legal and regulatory frameworks? How do you see this impacting investment in the field?
I think, as you said, it's necessary for the government to come in and create those supporting frameworks. And if you can allow me, I would want to use Kenya as a very clear example on doing that. Given a very clear background of the role SES played towards advancing this carbon and climate conversation, and the Kenyan government took a proactive role at coming up with the regulations that were in place. So there are two sides to the coin around that. The intention, very noble. The execution could have been done better. And it's a very thin balance for you to know how to create the supporting frameworks. Because, for instance, the bill the regulation had been given to us was suggesting frameworks that will not have, like the intention behind it was lost around it. So one of the frameworks we tried doing was, and it's being amended, so I'll give them that, was to put up, for instance, a national registry and setting up checks and balances to ensure that the players in the space are not taken advantage of, which is a problem that exists in the space. But how that was done was not really well. So there's a challenge of capacity building is what I'm trying to say here, where the people who are in charge of coming up with regulation do have a gap of understanding what it is that will be needed to create a conducive environment for investment. So the push towards creating regulatory clarity, I think I commend that, because not a lot of countries are doing that. And that gives a positive signal to investors to just sort of channel their finance here. How it was done is being improved, and there's a lot that can be done around that. And you'll probably tell me how much you want to delve into the specifics of the regulation within the Kenyan context. But overall, yes, frameworks will be important. The spirit behind it and the people who are trying to do that will need a bit of capacity building and a lot of stakeholder engagement with both the private sector and the community to make sure that all voices are actually included in this process so that you make it as inclusive as possible.
Well, Nyangena, as you know, carbon credits are very controversial generally around the world.
Yes, yeah.
And one of the key issues that arises is the rights of communities and benefit sharing. I think in some places in the global south, in Africa, there were carbon credit projects that were on community land, and communities got no benefit out of it. But with our recent changes to regulation, at least here in Kenya, communities stand to benefit at least 40%, almost 40% of the revenue from carbon projects. What are your views on this?
It is true. So rights to carbon credit are a very important discussion to be had. So in as much as you're getting carbon credits, the ownership of land, especially for forestry projects, for instance, is a special consideration that needs to be given. Most of the land across the continent is mostly government or community owned. So being able to establish the rights of those carbon credits and making sure that the community or the stakeholders involved actually end up benefiting from that is an important aspect. The regulation, as you said, for community-based projects has made a provision for 40% of carbon revenues to actually go to the community that are spearheading some of these community-led initiatives. We've seen registries. I'll give you a very clear example. There's a registry called Plan Vivo. It's not most commonly known, but it has the most, in my opinion, the most robust stakeholder engagement framework and clear benefit sharing mechanisms. So they had already given a provision that for any community-based project, 40% has to go to the community. Vera has it, but the frameworks are not that clear. So being able to incorporate that into our own regulations, for instance, within the Kenyan context, and I'm seeing countries like Ghana also doing the same, Rwanda trying to come up with frameworks to support that as well. I almost feel like we need to be careful on how we are doing this, the regulatory clarity and how will I put it? I'm trying to be very careful with the words that I'm doing so that I do not diminish the efforts that are being made around this, but also acknowledge the challenges that are there. It is important for you to say 40% of the carbon revenue go to the community. The next question then comes, what are the frameworks that support the channeling of those benefits back to the community? I feel like that's a discussion that's not been had quite much. And therein lies the challenge. Because if you're going to channel this through, let's say, a county government, put it as part of a fund, like what the regulation was saying, where part of the revenues can go towards a consolidated fund, or trying to support CBOs at a community level, for instance. Being able to be clear to get everyone in that ecosystem to understand how to channel those projects, creating the right accountability frameworks so that the 40% doesn't end up still getting lost around the, I can call it system, is very important. And that is a discussion I feel was not very clearly captured in our recent regulation that was put in. Granted, there was a lot of public stakeholder consultation from different players in the space, and these comments were actually passed by, and hopefully the ministry did take into account some of these things. So, in a nutshell, it is a very important step for us to consider that 40% to go to the community, because that's the only way you'll have community buying. The thing that's not being done really well is actually involving the community in that stakeholder engagement and making sure that their voices are actually heard. So that this 40%, what projects are you channeling them to? How will we use them? Do we need to have frameworks of saying this needs to support this SDG? Do we need to have separate SDGs for every county? Do we have a framework as a country that says we're going to support initiatives that fall around these 3 or 4 frameworks, so that that clarity is gotten all the way down? I almost feel like we need to approach a bottom-up framework as opposed to a top-down. And I'm seeing that work, but it can be done better. And mostly other countries as well can learn from these challenges so that when they're coming up with their own frameworks, they actually start taking into account that stakeholder engagement, because that voice did not come out clearly under the current regulation. Yes. But it's a positive steps toward trying to create clear channels and frameworks to support community-led initiatives.
Indeed. So we have talked about the legal and regulatory frameworks and the role they play in the realm of carbon trading. We have also touched on benefit sharing and the rights of communities with respect to the revenue generated by carbon projects. Nyangena, we are grateful for the invaluable contribution to this first episode of carbon trading and entrepreneurship that you have granted us. To our dear listeners, this wraps up our first episode of carbon trading and entrepreneurship, but our discussion does not end here. Please stay tuned for our second episode, where we will delve deeper into this fascinating realm. Your support means a lot to us. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.